Well,
Amen.
great evening, everyone. I am Dr. Karen Owens, Affiliate Faculty and Director of Strategic Research at Hood Theological Seminary. Welcome to the Center for Justice, Love, and Belonging. Last week, we discussed where do we go from here, how the church might address the critical issues facing us, and specifically, we discussed redistricting and the attack on voting rights, ICE and the onslaught of violence against Black and Brown people, gender identity, and the conservatives' war against the poor. Tonight, we will discuss white Christian nationalism. Where do we go from here? And it will be led by our panelists, Dr. Anthea Butler, Dr. Robert Jones, and Dr. Obery Hendricks. And before we begin, I'd like to ask the president of Hood Theological Seminary, Dr. Virgil Lattimore, to give us an official welcome. Dr. Lattimore.
Thank you, Dr. Owens, and good evening, brothers and sisters. We welcome you to this vital discussion that is both um, seeking a lot of attention and also been given a lot of attention. The wedding of, or the equating of Christianity with our faith of America is something that certainly I studied in seminary when I had the opportunity to meet Dr. Howard Thurman, who made a very clear distinction between the faith of Jesus or the actions of Jesus and Christianity as it's held out for the larger society. And I would just like to say that Hood Theological Seminary, both in its mission and in its activities, certainly sees this as a vital issue of discussion. And we're delighted that these distinguished scholars will dissect this issue in a very specific way. So thank you, Dr. Owens, for the opportunity to welcome this group.
Thank you, Dr. Lattimore. And I hope you all had an opportunity to read the extensive bios of our panelists this evening that appeared on our website. But if you didn't, I hope you'll take the time to do so. And I'm going to share with you just a snapshot of each of them. Dr. Anthea Butler is the Geraldine Siegel Professor in American Social Thought at the University of Pennsylvania, and she's currently at Oxford University on a senior coach fellowship. She's a historian of African American and American religion, and her research and writing spans African American religion and American religious history, race, politics, evangelicalism, media, and popular culture. Her recent book is White Evangelical Racism: The Politics of Morality in America. Professor Butler was a contributor to the 1619 book, A New Beginning, with a chapter titled Church. And her first book is Women in the Church of God in Christ, Making a Sanctified World. She's a sought after commentator, and she's an op-ed contributor to MSNBC. Her articles have also been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, NBC, and The Guardian. Welcome, Dr. Butler. Dr. Robert P. Jones is the president and founder of Public Religion Research Institute, known as PRRI, and a New York Times best-selling author. His most recent book is The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and the Path to a Shared American Future. He writes regularly on politics, culture, and religion for The Atlantic, Time, Religion News Service, and other outlets. He's frequently featured in major national media such as CNN, MSNBC, NPR, and the New York Times, the Washington Post, and others. He's also the author of White Too Long: The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity, which won a 2021 American Book Award, and he's the author of The End of White Christian America. He writes weekly at the whitetolong.net, which is a newsletter focused on religion, racial justice, and democracy. Welcome, Dr. Jones. And last but not least, Our third panelist, Dr. Obery Hendricks, is the most widely read and perhaps the most influential African American biblical scholar in America today. He's been a Wall Street investment executive, a theological seminary president, a distinguished senior fellow at the Democracy Collaborative think tank, and served in the U.S. Department of State Religion and Foreign Policy Working Group under Secretaries of State Hillary Clinton and John Kerry. Currently, he teaches religion and African American and African diasporic studies at Columbia University, is an advisory board member at the Institute of Christian Socialism, and a trustee of PRRI. Among his books is the best-selling The Politics of Jesus, Rediscovering the True Revolutionary Nature of Jesus' Teaching and How They've Been Corrupted, The Universe Bends Toward Justice, Living Water, and his most recent book is the critically acclaimed Christians Against Christianity: How Right-Wing Evangelicals Are Destroying Our Nation and Our Faith. Welcome, Dr. Hendricks.
Thank you.
So the panelists will present for the first 90 minutes, and the final 30 minutes is open for any questions you, the participants, have. So as the panelists share, please type your questions in the chat, and at the end, I will read them for our panelists to answer. Hopefully, we'll be able to address them all. We have quite a few. Then at 7:55, we'll conclude the session, and in the chat will be a brief survey that we like each participant to complete. This free course offering is presented via the Pathways for Tomorrow initiative of the Lilly Endowment Incorporated. And I also want to thank the Pathways for Tomorrow team for their support and assistance. President Virgil Lattimore, Dr. Clay Barrow, Dr. Regina Dancy, Reverend Thomas Grinter, Dr. Kevin Griffin, Dr. Sandra Oliver, Reverend Deirdre Parker, and Dr. John Everett. And special, very special thanks are extended to you, Dr. Obery Hendricks, because you assist the Center for Justice, Love, and Belonging in an advisory capacity. So thank you so much. So we're going to jump right in with the questions for our panelists. We have a few. We'll start off with defining white Christian nationalism and what distinguishes it from general patriotism or expressions of traditional Christianity. And I'm going to ask both Dr. Jones and Dr. Butler to answer this question. How do you define white Christian nationalism? Dr. Butler.
All right, thank you for having me. Um, I would say white Christian nationalism is based on the belief that the founders and framers of America believed that Christianity was supposed to be the law of the land. Now, I'm not saying that this is the truth. I'm just saying how you interpret it. Okay, so be very careful about what I'm about to say. That they believed that America was founded as a Christian nation, that white men were the ones that were supposed to lead this Christian nation, and that all of the events, everything that happens, revolves around how they see Christianity being a part of the political and social woof and weft of the nation. In other words, Christianity is the foundation in which this nation was built. Now, we know that that is not the case if you look at the founders and framers. But for people who believe in Christian nationalism, that is the case. Now, there's a lot of other different things I could say about that, but what I do want to say is that these are the sort of basic tenets and beliefs of what white Christian nationalism is all about. There are other things to say about that, and I'm going to let Dr. Jones fill that in, and then we'll kind of go back and forth about this.
All right, thank you, Dr. Jones.
Yeah, well, it's appropriate, I think, to have someone steeped in history and social thought like give the first answer to this question because I think we think of this term Christian nationalism as something kind of new, but it's very, very, very old. The concepts that it recognizes, in fact, I often say it is the where the moral compass of Christianity was set when it landed on these shores from Europe. All right, so it predates the Republic. This idea that yeah, as Dr. Butler said, this idea that this country is of, by, and for European Christians is a kind of divinely ordained promised land for European Christians, and everybody else has to kind of find their place somewhere down the hierarchical pyramid from there, with particularly white Christian men at the top of that pyramid. But today, when we measure it in using sociological tools, we actually measure it quite precisely and use a number of questions. I'll give you a sense of it because I think question I get often is like, well, how do you measure, something that's as broad and as complex as this? And the way we try to do it is we use a series of questions in combination with one another. So not just one question, but in our case, five questions. And we've been building on this. There's about a decade now of really solid political science and social science research. Here's how we do it at PRRI. And I'll just encourage everyone here that if you want to go way down the rabbit hole and see how we measure all of this, it's all on the Public Religion Research Institute website at prri.org. You can there and get all the details you want. But I'll just give you a little example here of here are the five questions that we use. These are agree, disagree questions. So God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of American society. The U.S. government should declare America a Christian nation. Being Christian is an important part of being truly American. If the U.S. moves away from our Christian foundations, we will not have a country anymore. And U.S. law should be based on Christian values. So we take all of those questions and then we kind of sort people by how strongly they agree or disagree, not just with one question, but again as a composite with all of them. And we use some statistical tools to then divide people into categories. We use four categories. If you basically completely agree with all five of those questions, we call that category Christian nationalism adherence. That's about 1 in 10 Americans, about 10% of the country. If you agree but not completely agree with those questions, we classify you as Christian nationalism sympathizers. That's about another 20% of the country. So with those two categories, people either completely agree with all five of those questions or mostly agree with all five of those questions. It's about 3 in 10 Americans. Now that leaves two-thirds of the country really leaning away from that worldview. In fact, we have in the next category people who we call Christian nationalism skeptics. It's about 37% of the country. It's people who disagree but not strongly. And then we have about 3 in 10 Americans who completely disagree with all of those questions. So that's kind of the lay of the land here today. But I think it's important to remember that these ideas, as Dr. Butler pointed out, they have a new kind of formation and new energy around them, and they are newly appended, really, to just so closely adhere to our partisan politics today. But they have a very, very old history. I sometimes kind of summarize it like this, like, really is this kind of ongoing battle between a vision of the country as a pluralistic democracy where everybody, regardless of race or religion, stands on equal footing before the law, or this idea of a divinely ordained promised land for European Christians.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Jones. Dr. Butler, in what ways has white Christian nationalism shaped American religious and political life historically?
How long do you have? Well, I want to talk about this in certain kinds of ways. Let's talk about it in the ways in which people will recognize things that you just don't even think about. Look at your money. Your money says, "In God we trust." That's part of what happened in Christian nationalism in the 1950s when that actually got put on our bills. When you think about how did that get added to the Pledge of Allegiance, one nation under God wasn't there, okay? And that was added in. You had to think about that. How this also happens is think about, ceremonies that you have that are, public ceremonies. I would say that there's a way in which we sacralize the flag and we also sacralize the cross around the same time with that. If you think about what happened with the Ku Klux Klan, using a burning cross as a kind of a nationalistic way of putting terror into people. So there's lots of different ways that this has happened and how people think about this and how that should be instantiated. Now, if you think about this, what we're dealing with currently in the United States, you could say that, 1/6/21 was a Christian nationalist event. It was promoted by people who prayed over the Capitol before they stormed it. Okay. And actually used Christian symbols in there, whether they used Catholic symbols or they used crosses or they used other religious kind of symbolism, they use those things in order to take the capital. And so for Christian nationalists, this becomes a very interesting kind of way of looking at this. The way that I think about this a lot is to think about what kind of kitschy things are people buying. And my favorite one is a dog looking up at the flag and praying, God bless America, because those things don't even make sense. But in this kind of world, in this kind of instantiation of Christian nationalism, you see these things everywhere. And that's Christianity light, Christian nationalism light. But there's another kind of serious Christian nationalism in terms of thinking about the kinds of tattoos that people get, where they try to invoke certain kinds of things that look like they're supposed to be Christian, whether they're talking about the Crusades, when they reach back to the 1000s to think about how the nation should be formed, how our country should operate in terms of Christianity. They look back to the past in order to bring that forward to the present. And so there's lots of different ways. It's a very open-ended question that you're asking, but I think we have to look for the symbols and the signs of Christian nationalism everywhere because they're all around us. They're
Mm.
definitely all around us. One last example. Most of you have probably been in a church for the 4th of July or something where you have the flag and the cross, and there's the Christian flag and the U.S. flag on the side. And it used to not be it. A lot of people would not even put a U.S. flag in their churches because they didn't want to signal that they were Christian nationalists. Now you see these kinds of events being mowed all into one. And so I like to mention that one of the churches I watch in Dallas usually has a 4th of July presentation. And they had a very elaborate thing where they had people rappel down from the ceiling, holding the Christian and American flags while they had guns strapped to them. So there's this kind of way in which Christian nationalism appears in these sort of ways that you think that are just kind of trashy, but they also do mean something and they establish something in people's minds.
Wow. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Butler. Dr. Hendricks, what are some of the theological or biblical interpretations that have been used to justify nationalist or exclusionary ideologies?
Okay, thank you. And I just want to say it's so good to be on here with my colleagues, for whom I so much respect. We work together, and these are brilliant folks, and glad we work together. Um, Christian nationalists, for one thing, they operate on misinterpretation of the biblical text, and misinterpretation of historical events. But a couple of the main biblical and misinterpretations. Well, the main biblical scriptures that they misinterpret to their own benefits, like Genesis 1:28 says, "Go forth and have dominion over all living things." I'm paraphrasing. And Matthew 28, at the end of Matthew says, "Go forth and make disciples of all nations." And Christian nationalists, what they've said is that, and Franklin Graham has said it publicly, this applies to them, and that they should have dominion over every creature, even though the Bible in Genesis 6,000 years before Chris, 6,000 years ago, I mean, had no sense of what Christianity would be, right? So it can't talk to Christians, but if it did speak to Christians, why would it just speak to one little partisan group of Christians? I mean, it's just ridiculous. But these people, they really do believe this. And then Matthew 28, when it says, "Go to make disciples of all nations," the Greek word mathetes, translated as disciples, means students. It means go forth and make students of all nations. Go forth and teach all nations, not go forth and force all nations to believe as they believe. And even if that was the case, why would it apply just to this small group of Christian nationalists? I mean, the whole thing is really ridiculous. But that really is, they really put so much purchase on this. And then you have this notion of Israel, America as the new Israel, which was which was much more popular in some circles, but it still has a lot of influence. Galatians talks about the Israel of God. Paul talks about that. And then you see First Peter and Ephesians. They talk about a new commonwealth of God and all that. Well, we've seen these nationalists apply it to America, that America is the new Israel. And so Christian nationalists, they embrace it as speaking, of course, to them again. I mean, it has something to do with white supremacy in that white supremacists think that everything is about them, that everything that gives people the right to dominate is it gives them the right to dominate. And these are all supremacist misinterpretations of the Bible. But I will say that they are all very purposeful, that they're not just mistaken, they're purposeful in their misunderstanding to serve their own ideological ends, which is to dominate the earth.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Hendricks. Let's look at some cultural and social implications. And we'll start with Dr. Jones. How does white Christian nationalism intersect with other social forces such as racism, gender politics, immigration, or economic inequality?
Well, another small question. I'll take a stab at it. You know, I think it's right for you to point to these intersections because what's behind all of this is really a set of hierarchies. Right. And so there are racial hierarchies where people of European descent are seen to be at the top of the pyramid, everybody else further down. There are gender hierarchies where men are seen to be at the top. Certainly, uh, that all plays together. I think this idea, right, the worldview is that again a divinely ordained worldview where God created these hierarchies and people are to stay in their place where God put them as this worldview goes. So it has a kind of powerful hold on folks. And the one thing I would say is that we actually find in the data that you can actually see these things connected to one another. So we measure attitudes about patriarchy and gender attitudes. People who score higher on that Christian nationalism scale, much more likely to support hierarchical gender attitudes, much more likely to hold anti-LGBTQ attitudes, much more likely to hold anti-immigrant attitudes. I mean, the whole America first attitude, right? And the nativist view of that. I mean, the irony of that, of course, is that all the Europeans who claim to be the real Americans were immigrants to this country, right? And the America first, like, really should mean the indigenous people who were here first, but that's not, of course, what it means out of those lips. We also find, for example, when you didn't name, but anti-Semitic attitudes are tightly linked to Christian nationalism. The higher you score on Christian nationalism, also the higher you score on anti-Semitic attitude. So but I think again, the thing that holds it all together is this kind of rigid worldview of hierarchies, really with white Christian men, really at the top of that pyramid.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. And Dr. Butler, what role has media, both secular and religious, played in spreading or challenging narratives of Christian nationalism?
I'm going to go in on spreading because I think
Okay.
there's not very many challenges out there, and somebody might disagree with me. I'll be interested to hear what the other panelists have to say. I think that one of the things that's really important is how Christian nationalism is being promoted, and not just now, but historically as well. If you think about this in the 1950s, one of the things that happened was thought about people were saying communism was bad, and so that was coming against people like Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and others who were called un-American. If we think back to when the Red Scare happened and people were put on the House un-American committees, there was a big push for this, and there was a lot of artwork that talked about, how you have to be for God and country and nation. And you're seeing that same kind of artwork come out again with Homeland Security. I wish I had a PowerPoint to show you the kinds of imagery that's coming out of this particular administration right now, because it looks like 1950s imagery. It's all white people. And it's all promoting certain kinds of things about the homeland and God and country, and even using scripture to promote what Homeland Security is doing. I'd be interested to hear Dr. Hendricks talk about that because I think that's a really important part of some of the really heinous things that are happening with immigration right now. I think that, there are very innocuous ways that we don't notice about how Christian nationalism is promoted in the media. If you think about going to a football game, you sing you sing the national anthem, obviously. But what I have noticed is that there's an element of Christianity that's being put into this. So whether you've got a gospel choir or you have a Christian singer or something, you might have that at a football game, and that gets instantiated into that sort of milieu into sports. And I think that's really a space where, again, we don't really pay attention to it, but it comes out in the same kinds of ways. I think another way that this happens, obviously, is the kind of materials that are promoted for kids. And media encompasses a lot of things. And so if you think about homeschooling materials right now are very much Christian nationalist materials about how they're teaching a different type of history that is like basically wrong, that talks about the nation in certain kinds of ways, that kids get this from very early on. And so, you have a deconstruction project when you get these kids that grow up to be young adults and they go to university and they think they've learned one version of history, and that's not the version that is the, correct version, right? There's not a version that has, African Americans or Native Americans or others included in that history. And I think that's really important. There's so much money that goes into the promotion of these kinds of materials with people like and I'm just forgetting his name. I'm just went blank out of my head. Unfortunately for me, it's almost tomorrow here, so forgive
Yeah.
me. But it's very interesting to see the amount of money that is poured into these kind of materials. Now, you think that you're asking a question, and I want to be really clear about this because the way that this question was posed, you said, "What is it that people are doing to not promote Christian nationalism?" And these three people here are trying to not promote Christian nationalism. There are a lot of us who aren't, but we don't have that same kind of media access that other people have. And I know that I can say this, without ruffling any feathers here because we're all friends in this group. But some of us have not had the media access that we used to have when this administration came in. I could say this for Robbie, especially because you used to be on TV all the time, and then that just stopped. That would just went cold. And so what you have to understand is also a censoring of how this material gets out. So right now we're in a space where, and I want to make this very clear, we are in an authoritarian space in which you cannot talk about unless there's some kind of, thing back to you, right? There is a cost to speak out, to say something that's against Christian nationalism right now. So I think we shouldn't be flip about putting this as an either or kind of thing, but to realize that we're in a system right now in the United States where it is not polite, it's not customary to speak out against Christian nationalism.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Hendricks, would you like to hone in on that?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I would. I in my last book, I talked about how the NRA was so successful in melding Christianity and Second Amendment as being uh, necessarily related. And then, when you see Christy Nome and and her militaristic forces coming out, and they're showing her all the time in her vest with armed men around. It's this is an image that is showing Christian America standing up, to protect to to protect America. It's the Christian nationalists who are protecting America. And then the way that they portray immigrants, right? Anthea, I mean, immigrants are, though, 99.9% of immigrants are law abiding. In fact, immigrants have lower rates of crime and criminality than the native born. They highlight their criminality, and they want to show the most wretched of them, and all of these images, play into serving to serving Christian nationalism, and we don't have the media. And Anthony, you talked about how we don't have access anymore to network television like we did once. Well, we know that's by design because the people who invited us have all been fired.
Right.
And it's because I used to be on there a lot myself, and all of a sudden, and it happened starting with Melissa Harris Perry. They're all gone. So this is very insidious and very systematic, much more systematic than most of America realizes, right? Because they are denuding um, everything, every access to power and to the media that would challenge them.
Can I just piggyback on that? I'm so happy that you all brought up Department of Homeland Security here. I do think I should invite everyone to go to the DHS Twitter feed, because it is this just onslaught, and what it does, it goes back and forth between, as you were saying, Obery, showing and making all kinds of wild claims about like the evilness of immigrants and showing these mugshots, right? And how they're kicking, all this kind of swagger and how they're kicking these people out of the country. And then it'll go to a shot of like a white couple in a prairie wagon with the
Yeah,
slogan "Defend your homeland." Right?
yeah.
And so it's white supremacists, it's Christian nationalists, and it is as bald as anything I've seen in my lifetime. I mean, no kidding. It's really quite something to see when you see that. And I also say, like, we should also just note that's here, Department of Homeland Security. We also have the head of our Department of Defense who has Crusader tattoos on his chest, right? And the words Deus Vult on his arm with a sword that translate to God wills it. That's what the Crusaders were saying, marching into Jerusalem to kill Muslims, right? This is the head of our Department of Defense.
Right on. And in Charlotte this week, ICE is all over the city of Charlotte, and it's all over the news. And this
Yeah.
weekend, it was showing, trying to show the criminality of the immigrants. It's quite
Yeah,
disgusting.
and there's hardly any. If you look at this thing, everyone on there is brown skin, black skin. Like there's
Yes.
not a single person with the mugshot, right, that looks like me on that reel.
Hmm.
And they're going into to provoke problems so then they can say, well, hey, we have to come in and save the community. I mean, this is horrible, and it's straight out of Hitler's playbook. I mean, it's no coincidence.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah, I think the other thing I want to say about this while we're talking is that it's a very interesting juxtaposition between what Christianity. And so this past week where there was a reverend, I'm going to forget his name right now, who was pushed down, and it's a very famous picture from the AP right now in Chicago where they were protesting outside of Chicago and they arrested him and kicked him, and there have been other clergy who have been shot. This is straight out of the playbook of the civil rights movement, right? It is the same thing. And then I just saw another one from, because they're in North Carolina, of a church that was raided, and they just came within the church service and dragged this man out. They didn't say they had anything. They did not have a warrant. They did not even know his name. They did not say his name. The kids were traumatized, and this is a reign of terror. There's no other way to call it. It is a reign of terror on brown and black people, and that is for I would say the pleasure of whites who believe in this, and also white Christians who believe in this, who think that all of these people are criminals. And so what we're dealing with is not just simply to talk about Christian nationalism, but we're talking about how people are redefining this. And I think especially since you all are a seminary, this becomes very important in which the ways in which we talk about this as a part of Christianities. Because what people would normally say is, oh, this is not Christianity. Unfortunately, this is a part of Christianity. And I think we have to reckon with that.
Yeah,
Right.
absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you. So let's look at theological and pastoral dimensions. For pastors and faith leaders, how can clergy talk about this issue of white Christian nationalism from the pulpit, in
Mhm.
study groups, etc.? Dr. Hendricks, would you like to address that first?
Yeah, well, that's presupposing that they want to talk about it, but
Exactly,
uh,
right. Yeah.
it's very ironic that a country that calls itself a Christian country is so biblically illiterate,
Mm.
and this it's a dearth of biblical knowledge that has caused all of this. And so, how can they talk about it? Well, one thing they have to do is read about it and learn about it. I mean, that's most pastors, and I say it all the time, and I'll stand on most pastors. Um, that I know of, and I've been all over this country since I was a seminary president in the 90s. They don't seem to realize their study is to use to study and to read and to be up on current events and to also understand the latest developments in biblical interpretation. Um, and so what first thing they have to do is become clear on what is the core of the faith. What is the core of the Christian faith? And and many of them you ask them, they'll say John 3:16 or something from Paul. And but their Savior Jesus Christ said, the core of the gospel is love your Lord your God, and all your heart, soul, mind, strength, love your neighbor as yourself. So on the horizontal social level, the greatest commandment is to love your neighbor as yourself. And we have to understand neighbor as being including strangers as well, not just those who live in your neighborhood, because strangers, the Gerim, immigrants are one of the three groups that are most vulnerable, and that the Bible tells us we have to look out for. And so first they have to understand that and start and try to focus on what are the implications of that. And so how do they talk about it? Well, one thing they can talk about is what does it mean to love your neighbor and the stranger as yourself on economic, political, and social levels. The other thing, and I've argued this in my last book, that the greatest Jesus' foremost mode of judgment that he gives is Matthew 25:31 through 46, which says, as you have not done it to the least of these, you have not done it to me. And he's talking about um, the way you judge people is whether they've tried to help someone, whether they're trying to help someone's substantially in material ways and all of that to make sure that they have decent life and decent lifestyle and all of that. And I mean, what it doesn't say is you judge people by where they're from, what their language is, what they look like, who they love, who they want to marry, and all of that. And I think what pastors have to do, if they would just take time thinking about those two basic things, that they would have a lot more to say to their people, and they'd have a lot more consciousness about what's happening in the country today. Now, what can they do in study groups? Well, every church can have I don't know, a political issues study group. You get, college professors or retired teachers or, folk who have the time and the education to keep up with what's happening, and they can write a list of issues that are important for people to be aware of and put that in the bulletin every week. It can be bullet points, and it can be written for the most basic educational level. That can be done. I've shared before that first time I spoke in Oakland for the late Reverend Dr. Smith. Oh my God, I'm so tired. I lost my friend's name. At Allen Temple AME Church. J. Alfred Smith. I'm sorry, and it was so interesting that when it came time for the announcements, the lady came down and I sat back. We're going to hear about fish fries and bake sales, and she started sharing with the people the events and developments of the past week that they should be aware of, local, state, and federal. They can do that. That's if these church and if these churches really want to make a difference, they can. They have a captive audience at least once a week. Also in Bible study, they can have the people focus on on Bible passages and verses that will raise their consciousness. So the biggest thing I think these churches and pastors and faith leaders can do is to realize that their calling, part of their calling, a major part of their calling, is to raise the consciousness of people and empower them so to the point that they can fight back about the issues and the forces that are destroying their lives. And I'll lastly say, pastors are supposed to be shepherds, and that means that they're supposed to not only care for their sheep, but to try to protect their sheep. And how can you protect the sheep if you don't know the forces that are trying to destroy and hurt the sheep? And I think this kind of perspective has to be disseminated and widely pushed. And I think that would make a huge difference in the church if we just raise the level of political consciousness and biblical consciousness, even just a little bit.
Mhm. And I think too that can come from the seminary training, you
Oh,
know,
absolutely, absolutely. If
you
I
know,
might say that, you're
yeah,
absolutely right, because seminaries do not do a good job of preparing folk. I mean, there are courses you can take that are electives that might give you some skills, but seminaries do not teach pastors, from what I've seen, prepare them with the realization that their calling is to change the world, not just to change the way people feel, to make it a more just world. That's what the sole sovereignty of God, or mistranslated as the kingdom of God, is supposed to be about: a more just world and social, political, and economic system. Jesus said, I'm getting carried away, but Jesus said, the Spirit of the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the
right,
poor, which is systemic justice, changing the
exactly.
social order.
Exactly. That's what I was going to say. You know, if we truly understand who Jesus is, how can we not address things that way? Thank you so much, Dr. Hendricks. Dr. Butler. And thank you, Dr. Butler. I know it's quite a time difference, so thank you for your sacrifice for being with us, being in Oxford right now. But in your view, how does silence or neutrality from churches contribute to the endurance of nationalist or racialized ideologies?
I mean, I think that's really simple. You don't say anything. Right? You don't say anything when nobody comes for your people. And what's interesting to me about this, and now I'm gonna fuss because this is, this is Hood Seminary, so I'm saying a few things, okay?
And,
Mark,
and
And
this is not just
and,
hood,
and
this
if
is
anybody get
lots of
their feelings
folks.
hurt out there, you just gonna have your feelings hurt.
That's
you are
okay.
Um,
Anthony
so
Butler. You know that you know how to fuss. So.
yeah, I do, and you knew it was coming, Obery, right? You knew. How long was it gonna take?
I
Because it
love
don't
it.
take that long, but you can always count on it. But see, this is my fussing. I mean, silence right now. I'm thinking about the churches that I see involved in Chicago and in other places in the country. I'm waiting for the black church. Where y'all at?
Yeah,
Where
that's
y'all at?
exactly.
This is the thing I'm gonna fuss about. Oprah, you were there when we were in Atlanta at the beginning of this year, 2025, when everybody finally wanted to talk about what Christian nationalism is. And where did I spend the last 4.5 years? Talking to white churches and white institutions about Christian nationalism. And then black people woke up and went, oh my God, maybe we need to talk about this. And I'm like, you know what? It's too late. You need to be talking about how you're going to fix this up so that you are not taken aback and you are not taken up by all of this. I mean, there's a moment in which there should have been action, and now we are behind and trying to catch up to what this is. And this is one of the reasons why this is one of the last talks I'm giving because I'm like, I'm tired of talking. I
Yeah,
need to write and I need to help people who want to do something. But right now, what we're faced with is you have churches that are being raided by ICE agents. This didn't used to be in the 1980s. You had the sanctuary movement. Churches were sanctuaries. You could keep people in a church. You can't keep people in a church now because they're gonna come into church and get you, right? You had, Homeland Security drop down on a whole apartment building in Chicago. Did I hear most people talk about this? The people I heard talk about it were people who have been watching this kind of thing in the media and others. Where are our churches? They talking about Beyonce and other things that they don't need to be talking about. So this is
right.
why I get upset when, you're right, Aubrey, that we have training in seminaries for people to do this stuff. But when we just so in the pastors who are putting parking cars in the middle of the church and they're not thinking about what's happening to what's happening around them, then we have a serious morality problem in terms of where we are as Christians, and Christians that should be salt and light instead of trying to figure out how they're going to get their next $100,000 or their next offering or whatever that the case may be. So I think to me the silences are not silences, but they're ignorance. And it's not just the ignorance of it, it's the willfulness of not looking at this and seeing the dire state of what their Christianity is.
Yes,
Well,
exactly.
it's pastoral malpractice, in my opinion. I mean, they're majoring in minor things not not paying attention to the fact that they are supposed to be fighting evil. In fact, what we're fighting, we're faced with this evil. If you define evil as um, that which needlessly or purposely harms innocent people, just because, or to serve your own interest, just because, with Trump, because he's a malignant narcissist, and cruelty is one of the main characteristics of that. But others, they just, yeah, it's just evil. They're serving their need to dominate, their desire to dominate. And many churches I go to, I speak to denominations too, they don't even talk in terms of good and evil anymore. You know, I mean, how can you not do that? And I'm AME. I was president of AME Seminary. I sat on the general board. I know a little bit about African Methodism, and it's shameful. We can we can be so proud and brag about having a worldwide denomination. And I'm wondering, when did my denomination ever take a stand against Donald Trump? It's the easiest thing in the world to do, to know that this sick piece of trash is looking to destroy the sheep of their flocks. They do nothing. The black church is one of the major malefactors in this, I'll tell you. And the right-wing evangelicals, even though I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Robbie, they're like, what, 15, 18% of the population, these folks, something like that. Well,
13.
13%. Well, then how are they're 13%, but they're winning because we allow them to win. And it's shameful. And we have to start calling this out for what it is. I'm sorry, Anthea. You're not the only one fussing, because this hits me where I live. I have an 8-year-old great granddaughter. My first child was born when I was 13, but no, that's not true. But I have an 8-year-old great granddaughter, and I wonder, it scares me to death. What will her life be like in 10 years?
That's
And
right.
I'm watching these guys fiddle while Rome is burning, and it
Mhm.
burns me up. And I'm gonna say this last thing. When I grew up in the Black cultural nationalist movement in Newark, we didn't play. I can recall going and pulling preachers out of their houses and telling them, you have to start doing right. We have to stand up against and call out the church. Martin Luther, he was good in some ways, but the way he nailed those theses to the church wall, yeah, it's about time to do that. And if Jesus was here, yep, he'd be going through the church, turning it out like he did in the temple. That's my belief.
Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
And unfortunately, a lot of times what we hear from our clergy, and I'm going to talk about clergy specifically, we just gonna pray about it.
Oh, Jesus, Lord have
You know,
mercy.
that's what that's what we hear. No action. We just gonna pray about it.
Pitiful.
Dr. Jones, did you want to hone in on
Yeah,
any of
I just had a couple. I mean, I'm not going to add a whole lot to both of these eloquent comments, but I will add just a couple of things. I think both Dr. Butler and Dr. Hendricks brought up the danger here, and I think that the problem is that denominational church leaders can only see the danger in rocking the boat. That's the only thing that's dangerous, right?
Wow.
But I think what we're sitting around and letting this virus infect the congregation, that's dangerous too, right? If you don't act to intervene when there is something making inroads, and I'll say this too, one of the things that has surprised me when we measure Christian nationalism, by far the people that schedule or score the highest is 2/3 of white evangelicals that we all know supported Trump, 85% of their vote every time he's been on the ticket. 2/3 of them are either Christian nationalist adherents or sympathizers. But among African American Protestants, that number is north of 4 in 10.
Mm,
Right now, it's not a majority, but it is north of 4 in 10, which means that the Christian nationalists kind of in is making some inroads, right? Even in African American Protestant circles, and that's something that's going to come back to bite us if we don't step up and across the board, right, and say, oh no no no, like we've got to take a stand against this, and it's actually a danger, right, to us not to recognize that's the danger. The silence is the danger in the moment that we're in, and we've only got. I'm just going to say this, like we don't have 3 years, right, to sort this out. We got like months to sort
Mm-hmm.
this out, and because once we get to the midterms, if we even have free and fair elections in the midterms, and that is not a given, if we're not organized ahead of that, I think it's going to be game over. We got to be take that really seriously.
yeah. And Robbie, you're so right. At north of 4 and 10, um, black denominations who lean toward Christian nationalism, that's just reflective of the whole problem that we're dealing with now. I mean, uh, with regard to the political environment, with regard to this right-wing onslaught, this Christian nationalist onslaught, and in some ways, the black church, more than churches in general, um, are part of the problem, are facilitators of it. You talk about pastoral malpractice. I mean, it's really, really criminal. How can and it comes down um, to this, I'd call it almost a willful ignorance because you know it's well, let's say it's a theological problem because folk do not the pastors do not really focus on the gospel. They'll talk about Paul, they'll talk about Old Testament stuff, but they don't teach and preach what's empowering and and the consciousness raising of the people. And so, Robbie, that statistic is just really, really criminal. I mean, it's just, oh man, you have to forgive me. I'm so angry now hearing that. It's just disgusting.
Yes, thank you. All right, so let's consider personal and communal reflection. Dr. Jones, what does it look like for a congregation or an individual believer to engage in self-examination around complicity with nationalism or exclusion?
Yeah. Well, I spend most of my time with predominantly white congregations. It's both kind of, I grew up Southern Baptist. I kind of right out of that experience of, coming out of that evangelical, conservative world that was all so wrapped up with white supremacy and its very identity, right? I mean, remember that, I think it's always worth saying, that is kind of like oh, that's why we're here. Not such a surprise, right? Is that the largest Protestant expression of Christianity uh, uh, by the middle of the 20th century was the Southern Baptist Convention, right? It's the largest denomination, Protestant denomination. That's the denomination I grew up in Mississippi. But it is also the denomination that, of course, has as its birth story, right? 1845, splitting from the Northern Baptists over the issue of slavery, defending the right of a Christian missionary to enslave other people and take them to the mission field. Like that is the birth story of what became the largest expression of Protestant Christianity in the country. So you take that seriously, it like, oh, okay, well, yeah, that makes sense then. If we gave it that much air, that much oxygen, it drug the whole country a certain direction, right? And that's where we're still really, I think, wrestling with. It is so deep in the DNA, and I think like the challenge that I find, like I'll it's not uncommon to go into a predominantly white Christian church that's inviting me to come talk about white Christian nationalism, and look up in the stained glass window and see white Jesus
Yes.
and a flag in the sanctuary at the congregation that's asked me to come talk about the problem of white Christian nationalism. And I've just made a point of like every time I'm in a congregation like that, I was like, white Jesus, right, has got to go, right? If you're taking this seriously, that flag has got to go. If you're taking this seriously, like that's part of the thing. We just sat so comfortably, with these things that are tarnishing the gospel and conflating, yeah, this kind of jingoistic nationalist identity with what it means to be Christian. And so I think it's a real challenge. And for predominantly white congregations, well, first, I think are so used to being comfortable, right? And like if I were to take a word, I would describe what being Christian mostly means. It means like a sense of propriety,
Mhm.
right? It's kind of what it boils down to, right? Respectability and propriety, right? You get your name on the pew and you give enough money to the church, you become a deacon, right? And you're a pillar of the community. And like, that's really what it boils down to. But that's got absolutely nothing to do with being Christian, right? In fact, it's in the way of being Christian. And to those more courageous things that Dr. Butler and Dr. Hendricks are pointing to, I'll end with this. I mean, I titled my kind of previous book, "White Too Long." Right, and that's a James Baldwin quote, and from an op-ed that he wrote right after Dr. King's assassination, and he was so distraught, right, even after King getting gunned down, that the great mass of white Christians in the country were still just sitting around, right? There was no big uprising. There was no like, okay, we crossed a line and now we're all in. None of that. And he basically just said. He said, I've been impressed and have been for a long time that the great majority of white Americans are beyond any conceivable hope of moral rehabilitation. They have been white, if I may so put it, too long. They've been married to the lie of white supremacy too long. And we are still wrestling with that, I think, in many white Christian churches. In fact, the very thing that I can say, we can use the words black church and white Christians, and it means something to us, right? I
Mm.
mean, that's blasphemy. That should even have those words should be nonsensical to
Exactly.
us. But we all know what we're talking about. We said that we're because of our history, right? We're still, this is kind of taking us back to the roots of so much of this stuff. But I think for many white Christians, it's going to take some real courage because it's going to mean that like if we pull on this thread, this white Christian nationalist thread, yeah, it's going to mean the stained glass, whether it's Tiffany glass or not, it's got to come down, right? And we're going to have to like really wrestle with this legacy of where the money came from to found this sanctuary that was, built in 1845. We know where that money came from, and really wrestling with that legacy and being willing to do something about it.
Well, and the tragic part of that is, as you talk about the white Jesus, the image of the white Jesus in the white church, we have those same images in the black church. I saw
Yeah,
one just this past weekend, and I
yeah.
asked the pastor, "Is that a white Jesus on your wall?" So we got to do some work ourselves in the black church because to me, it's an endorsement or a buy-in in our church to the white Christian nationalism. And it was in a Zion church. White Jesus crossed the wall. So what are we saying
Yeah,
when we say,
yeah, just, I don't mean any harm to these people, but I have to share it. I was a speaker at a service in Charleston, it's at Mother Zion AME Church where the 9 people were killed. Um, and that Denmark Vesey came out of the church and everything. I was absolutely shocked to the point of being horrified that they have this huge white Jesus
yes. Hmm.
in this church, and I don't know if there's a hue and cry about it or not, but it's still there. Even this was a couple years after the shooting, and and the way that shooting sort of uh, it became part of the national racial consciousness, but they still had that white Jesus.
Hmm.
That's tragic, so tragic.
It's tragic. It's tragic. Well, thank you. So, Dr. Hendricks, I'm going to ask you, how can we create spaces for honest dialogue that are both truthful and compassionate? How can we create spaces?
Well, I want to hear what my brilliant colleagues have to say about this, but I don't know that the other side wants any space for truth
Mhm.
dialogue. Um, um,
Yeah, I was going to say that I think,
just,
that would mean
just a
that,
minute, Anthea, let me finish, please.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were past it. I didn't know.
No, I'm
Oh,
not passing. No, I want you to hear after I say it. I'm sorry. Let
oh,
me
I'm sorry.
get my,
Sorry.
no problem. Let me get my little bit out. Then you can,
Yeah, no, no. I'm sorry.
and you can put, put a more profound spin on what I was to say.
Forgive
Oh,
me.
no. That was I presented that wrong. I articulated that wrong, and I understand why you started. Let me just say this. I think that they don't want. I think, yeah, guys have to help me. But when folk declare themselves your enemy, you have to take them seriously. That doesn't mean you don't acknowledge their humanity and love their humanity, but you have to acknowledge that when people want to destroy you. Now, I realize that there are some folk who are wrong, but they're sincerely wrong. They don't know any better. And, consciousness raising measures, are important, but creating spaces for dialogue, I don't know how to do that with a Christian nationalist congregation, because Christian nationalism, uh, it entails a certain level of white supremacy, and also a certain level of, from what I've seen, of malevolence
Mhm.
um, for the image of people of color that has been created. So, I mean, that's how I see. Maybe I'm too pessimistic, but Anthea, please, and Robbie as well, please.
I don't think you're pessimistic. I think it's the realism of realizing that it's very hard in today's world to have some kind of discourse with people who are different from yourself because the discourse has been so, how shall I put this, bastardized. In other words, people just yell and scream at each other. That is the level of discourse that we have now.
Mm,
So, I mean, I think that's the first thing. I mean, let's take something as innocuous that's going to happen next week, Thanksgiving. Most white people are not going to confront any of their Trump-loving parents or their Trump-loving relatives next week. They're going to be the closest people who will be able to say something and like, how do you think this is going for you now since the eggs cost more to make the pumpkin pie and everything else and the turkey costs 3 times more than it did last year? How's that working out for you, right? Or how's it working out that you don't have the same things on the table or that the food line is longer? How do you have that kind of discourse when people are, hurting so much? That's number one. I think number two is that it's not about having the discourse across the table right now. It's even just having the discourse with people who are in your church.
yeah,
And how do you talk about it within the circles of people who you think might even just agree with you,
yeah.
right?
Hmm.
Because I don't know that you can get that with anything else. I think that's two. And number three is, the way in which people used to have, you had your Bible study or everything else. It's as though people don't want to talk about the difficult things anymore. And
Hmm.
so even if you're in Bible study and you're saying, you're just doing something very simple that for Bible study that we talk about Jesus feeding the 5,000. You could talk about that in terms of people who are standing in line who don't have SNAP this month, right? And that's part of Christian nationalism because basically what has happened is we've turned into a prosperity gospel, country in which you don't, if you are poor, you don't deserve to have anything. And that's part of Christian nationalism too. We have to sort of realize that is that making sure that people have something to eat is some of the most basic kind of Christian principles there is, right? Did you clothe me? Did you feed me? Did you give me some water to drink, right? We can't even measure up to that. So that's a place to start, but we don't have community. And I think that part of this is about the individualism of the salvation narrative that we
Yeah,
have in this country that, Jesus saved me and the hell with you.
yes, yes. Too much Paul and too little Jesus.
Yeah.
Yeah,
All right.
exactly.
I'll just add one little bit here. I've been thinking about this a lot, and I do think we're in a different moment now, and I think a lot of people, sort of center, progressive, Democrat, don't realize the moment we're in, right? And so I think a lot of this conversation about, like, I think there's a division of labor. I want to make room for that. I know there's like some people who are like, I'm a missionary to the Christian nationalists, and I'm like, God bless you, more power to you. But I do think there is also, this is a moment of like for resistance, right?
Yeah,
And I think that's actually to my book right now, more important than bridge building, right? If we were going to persuade people, we would have done that 5, 10 years ago, right? And we don't see any movement really on that. The marks, every time Trump has been on the ballot, if you look at the religious breakdown of the vote, it has not moved hardly at all. All across from in the last decade, every time Trump has been on the ballot, the only post-mortem piece I wrote after the election, I titled "What White Christians Have Wrought." As a piece of Time magazine, because we all know white evangelicals, 85% voted for Trump, but white non-evangelical Protestants voted 6 and 10 for Trump. White Catholics voted 6 and 10 for Trump every single time, right? Not a movement. Can't say like they didn't know what they were voting for this time. They've had 3 opportunities, right? And they knew exactly what they were going to get. But I really think this sense of like uh, yeah, you can't build bridges with people during the day who are going to go strap in dynamite to the piers at night, right? And that's just not going to work. And you think about like, we're just going to need a heavier dose of thinking like Douglas, right? Power concedes nothing, right? Without a demand, right? And it's almost as if you talk to some progressives, and particularly white progressives, and it feels like they think that the civil rights movement came about because people sat around in rooms and persuaded the other side that equality was a good thing, right? And suddenly the light bulbs went off and people went on. It's like, no, that's not what happened at all, right? Confrontation was the thing that broke the dam finally and led to civil rights legislation. It was like a lot of like in your face, drawing hard lines, saying this and not that. And I think we're gonna have to find some ways to really make those. We may not get them right all the time, right? But we're gonna have to kind of draw those lines and say, yeah, from us as a Christian point of view, like, no, this thing that ICE is doing, that is not Christian, and we're not going to stand by and pretend that it is and call people out.
Exactly.
I have to say I'm really energized by this conversation because both my colleagues have written very challenging books, as part of the resistance, which is very important. And I think both of you I'm sure have gotten death threats, but we continue on. And part of the resistance is doing the kind of work that we do. Part of the resistance, Robbie, is PRRI doing such important statistical demographic work so we know what's really going on and what people are thinking and who we have to deal with, and how we have to deal with them. So this is so very important. But I think that you're right, both of you. It is about resistance now. And Anthony, you hit it on the head. We need to do work in our own churches, our own communities. And it's hard work. And I'm sorry, but part of it has to be taking a page from Fannie Lou Hamer when she used to stand up in church and say, wait a minute, Pastor, now that's not in the Bible. Now that's
Mhm.
not right. We have to stop treating ministers, and I'm ordained too. Don't get me wrong. I'm not an outsider, but we have to stop treating ministers like there's some kind of privileged class, and like the priestly aristocracy that Jesus fought, because that's what they're acting like. They're more focused on maintaining their prosperity and their privilege, and their position than they are getting out and fighting. How many ministers even get their shoes dirty anymore?
Right.
So, resistance has to be on the home front, and we have to mount so we can mount resistance against those from the outside who are trying to destroy our rights. And it's all of our rights. And Robbie, I know, and a lot of people might say, well, it's not the same for whites. Wait a minute. We're all at risk. And Robbie, I know you're at risk because you're a very visible person who's mounting a lot of influential resistance against Trump. And these folk can come up, drive up and say, um, um, we understand that you're undocumented. Say, wait a minute, I'm not undocumented. Well, we have to sort it out at the facility. They can do that. And that's why everybody is at risk here. And we have to mount our resistance with that in mind.
Exactly. So let's talk a little bit about where do we go from here as we start to wind down this discussion with you, the panelists, and I will share some of the questions from the participants because we have a few that have come in. And we've talked about it a little bit, but what practical steps, Dr. Hendricks and Dr. Jones, can local congregations or faith-based organizations take to confront or dismantle white Christian nationalism? What are some practical steps that we can take?
Hmm. Well, I'd say for one thing, stop having so many damn preaching conferences. So many, you know, pat ourselves on our backs about how religious we are, religious we are, and start um, having conferences that raise the people's consciousness and give them tools for resisting. Now, I'll say, I spoke at a gathering of Black Seventh Day Adventists in Alabama, of all places. Well, that's where they're the headquarters. But I thought Seventh Day Adventists were, political sense, were pretty null and void. But these folk came together. It was very impressive. They had lawyers, they had legislators who were breaking down the issues and and giving marching orders and explaining the kinds of things they could do to make a difference. So those are the kinds of things that congregations can do. But what they really have to do, I'll go back to it again, is study the heart and the core of the gospel they claim to believe in, to be guided by. Find out what the hell your faith really says. And folk have to take personal responsibilities, not just listen to the preacher on Sunday, no matter how smart he is, no matter how prophetic and on point he is. Folk have to realize that we have the same responsibility as Jews take to know their scriptures,
Yeah.
and they study hard, and Muslims, they study. Everyone studies but us. We gonna listen to the preacher, and it's criminal. So those are some of the things I think that we can do. One other thing, I think, well, no, I'll leave it at that.
You sure?
For now.
Okay. All right, Dr. Jones.
Well, I'll just say a couple of things I've seen work. Is actually partnerships that get, particularly, and I'm again mostly speaking about white churches here, get white churches out of their comfort zones.
Yeah.
There's a church I wrote, two churches I wrote about in Macon, Georgia. Again, not a liberal place, but there's two First Baptist churches in Macon, one predominantly white, one predominantly black, and they used to be the same church in 1820.
Yeah.
Right? But then they sat around for 150 years doing their own thing, literally around the corner from each other, never talking to each other. And they finally got two ministers, younger, who just kind of looked at each other like, "What are we doing? Like, we really should figure out how to reconnect." And they actually entered into a multi-year covenanted relationship to try to get the two congregations to get to know each other. So it wasn't like a pulpit swap. It wasn't like the Thanksgiving choir swap. It was like, no, we're actually going to get the people to know each other. And it was bumpy and messy and all of those things, but it actually did pay some dividends down the road. I think that really did change the way they approach things, and I think particularly for the white congregants, um, ended up showing up for things that they would have never shown up to before because it just wasn't on their comfortable radar screens, right? But it introduced a level of accountability and growth. I think that I think many actually they first found it deeply uncomfortable, but then found it actually exciting, right? That you could that there's this word discipleship, right? And uh, that actually can be an exciting thing if it's not just kind of memorizing some scriptures that you pin up on your mirror, right? But actually doing something. Like you said, I love that image, Obery, of getting your shoes dirty, right? That you're actually out carrying it out, and doing something out in the streets together. That's a different sort of thing. So I think those kind of partnerships that we still need. I mean, we've got such segregated congregations still in the country today. And I think that can make a real difference.
That's
Yes, thank you. And we talked a little bit already about seminaries needing to look at their curriculums and universities and so forth and so on. But exactly how do you think, or what does that look like? How can seminaries and universities prepare future leaders to address these challenges? What kinds of courses or what can we do to address these challenges?
Let me say the first thing that annoys me greatly about many seminaries in this country. Most of them have decided to get rid of most of their history requirements. And this is why we're in the place that we're in, because if you don't know history, you don't know how to deal with what we're at, where we're at right now.
Mhm.
Okay. So, it's wonderful that, people think that you should only have, this much of church history or whatever. But I think it's really important to understand the kind of history that, Robbie's talking about, where you got two churches that are around the corner from each other. And the Southern Baptists got started with slavery, and so did the Presbyterians, and so did how do we have these denominations that have split, first of all? If you don't understand that, you don't understand anything about the racial politics in this country. I think there's a lot of, black seminaries, let me just excuse my French, that don't even know black church history. I think that, part of this is having to understand that the AMEs could not have come about, without certain things happening in Philadelphia, right? And
Right.
being denied the communion rail, being denied incorporation for a number of years before they even could become incorporated in the state of Pennsylvania. So I think it's really important to see what that arc is of history, first of all. Secondarily, I think that, everybody gets, pastoral care or they go out into the community or whatever. I would like to see people do different kinds of community service. I would like to see them, having to go out to some different places. You go to a food bank, you go, obviously people go to prisons and do that kind of thing, but there's more to do in the community. And I think those things are important, but we need to step those up as well. Third, and I'm just going to be really blunt here because I think this is crucial. There needs to be more training about sexuality. This is a huge problem. And if you don't think that that goes to the nationalistic problem, it does, because when you start to talk about how you see gender issues and everything else, if you're not dealing with this, if you're talking to people who are either homophobic or they've got all these other kinds of ideas, how are they going to operate in a society where people are being vilified? And so, for instance, right now, where we have trans people who are being, vilified, immigrants who are being vilified, all of this, if you can't get there and be Christ-like with somebody, how do I expect you to talk about Christian nationalism? Because you're just as bad as a nationalist.
Mm.
And I think that's something that we really have to start to contend with, no matter where we see ourselves on the faith trajectory. I know that's probably really dangerous for a lot of people to hear. And then I think also too is that to interrogate who's teaching scripture. I mean, I've just heard so much. I'm with Obery. I've heard so many tired sermons of people who don't know how to exegete scripture anymore. It makes me sick. I can't even be bothered to go to some of these churches to crack the door open because they're just so bad. It's really terrible. I mean, I just don't even want to listen to half of these folks because it's the ignorance of not being able to do the kinds of things that they need to do in order to be, trained pastors. And then also too, I think the other part of this is to be aware of what's involved in the community. And when I say that, I mean thinking about the ways in which people need to just learn about the doggone government. They need to learn civics. And we have so many people in churches right now who don't understand civic engagement, which is part of the reason why we are where we are. This is why
Mm.
we are losing our democracy. We've lost our democracy pretty much. How we rebuild it is going to be something else altogether. But if you don't know what civic engagement is in the first place, and you just think that that's past their anniversary, you got it wrong.
Yeah,
Mm.
yeah. And I like how you're talking about the importance of knowing your history. I think it was Cicero that said something like, if you don't know your history, it's to remain as a child or something like that. So the importance of knowing where we come from. And then Dr. Hendricks, if
Excuse
you
me.
could,
Go ahead. I'm sorry. But
were
no,
you
that's
going to say something? Okay, if you could issue one call to action to the people that are on this Zoom tonight, what would it be?
okay. Before I say that, I just like to piggyback on what Anthea shared, which
Okay.
is also very
Mm-hmm.
important. Not only, Anthea, do they not teach history enough, but what the history they teach is so narrow. You don't learn about um, other Christian, like Orthodox, like Eastern Orthodox traditions and all of that. The importance of Ethiopian Christianity, which runs so deep and so old. And also, there should be more Bible taught. And And, I mean, preaching, and stop lifting up preaching like it's the most important thing on earth. It's not. And that
Mm.
it's sickening. It's all about preaching. And I'm going to say this, and I don't care who does not like it. We need to interrogate the Black preaching tradition.
Mm.
I mean, some of it, I mean, I'm from Farmville, Virginia, and I remember going to my grandmother's church out in the country, St. Louis Baptist Church, out in the country. And some of that tradition is so culturally rich and it's empowering, but some has just gotten to be ridiculous. All kinds, you gotta holler all the time and all of that. It's just playing on people's emotions, and
Yeah.
you got to end up with a loud celebration and all of that, and it misses the profundity. I think the other thing is there has what passes for spirituality these days is just emotionality. I mean, there's no tradition of interiority, that we can appeal to. How can you hear the still quiet voice of God if everything is about shouting and talking all of the time? We need to put less emphasis on preaching and more on spiritual growth. And to answer your question, you said, what was the question you asked again?
If you could issue one
One
call
call
to
to action.
action, what
Oh,
would it be?
well, I'd say, the Gospel of Mark shows Jesus always being on the way. The way, always on the way. I
Hmm.
call, get out and start propagating and start um, uh, raising the people's consciousness so that they really understand what the faith is about and what we are facing here. And that, so much of that goes to the fact that we must become more biblically literate if we're going to be relevant at all in this struggle. So those are the kinds of things. There's more than one, but I had I had to offer the things I think are relevant and important.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Jones, Dr. Butler, would you like to address that? What would be one call to action that you would recommend?
I think I just go back to sound the alarm. I think we just do not have nearly enough people realizing the place that we are already in.
Yeah.
We are living in a backslidden democracy, if we can still call it that. That's sort of propped up by a apostate version of white Christianity. So I think we've got to let people know, like, really, I was not being hyperbolic when I said I think we've got months, not years, to figure this out, right? And so it's going to mean some very quick organizing, some very quick movement if we've got any hope of kind of pulling the fragile democracy we have back from the brink. I mean, we really are in it right now, and I've kind of used this metaphor. People. It's not rocket science, but to try to wake people up and say, look, we I'll put it this way: I'm having more and more sympathy for the German Christians every month we live
Mhm.
in this regime, because growing up, they were always the easy example, right? Of why didn't they stand up? Why didn't they see what was going on, right? In 1930s Germany, this line got crossed and that line got crossed, you're right. And that Albert Niemöller, poem. First they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't say anything because I wasn't a trade unionist. Then they came for the communists. Didn't speak up. I wasn't a communist. Then they came for the Jews, right? I didn't speak up, and then ultimately there's nobody left to speak for me. But what's notable about Niemöller is that like he himself was a Nazi sympathizer, right? Before he was arrested, he was a Nazi sympathizer for 6 years before he was arrested. And so he reflected on that after the war. And I think none of us want to find ourselves in a position of realizing way too late that we sounded the alarm, right? Like we've got to do that like right here, right now. Now's the time. So I think if I'd say anything, like you know, it is almost impossible to be hyperbolic about this right now. So
Mhm.
I don't think you could worry about being too far over the line. I mean, if anything, all of our instincts are telling us to be too quiet right now. But we are in a absolute state of 5 alarm fire emergency in the country right now.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah. Dr. Butler?
I think you have to ask yourself one simple question. What are you going to do when somebody gets snatched in front of you? What are you going to do?
Mm-hmm.
Because that's where rubber meets the road for me. I have been thinking about this a lot because, there was a young man who was at one of the universities in Boston who had been calling and calling and calling on a car wash people that were there. And most of the men who worked at this car wash were citizens, all right, or had they were in some kind of visa process. But he kept calling because he said, these are people who are taking jobs away. Like, what are you going to do when you know somebody like this? Who would be willing to call on people you don't even know and rat on them to ICE so that they can get picked up. Yeah, Obery, you and I'll be right here. Okay. But we might not be able to respond like that. What would you do? Or like my one of my friends who teaches at a university out in California, he got a call. We were in Europe this summer. He got a call. His one of his students got picked up by ICE because he was filming at a Home Depot. This is a person who was a citizen in the United States, born and raised in the United States. And he was in jail for 2 days. They put him in the Fed jail. They didn't put him in a regular jail. They put him in the Fed place. And basically he got out. And it was terrible because this young man was doing nothing but trying to record what was going on. What are you going to do? And I think that's the bigger question is like when this happens, because as Robbie said, we are here. There's no like not being here or this is somewhere down in the deep distant future. It's now. And as I've told people for years, people are like, well, can't we just vote our way out of it? Well, not if you had gerrymandered to death. You can't. It doesn't matter. So now what are you going to do? How do you think about this? What can you do to help your neighbor who is being unjustly picked up and accused right now? How are you going to do that? How are you going to make a neighborhood watch? Because see, it's not enough to go out to a march for All Kings Day. That's great to hold up some signs and stuff, but what happens after that? That was what I loved that, but I was also very annoyed by it because nobody was organizing. Organize something on top of that. Organize, do something more than just get together and show your grievances because the right is showing their grievances all the time, but they've organized. This is why we are where we are right now, is because people have been organizing for 50, 60, 70 years to get to the place that we are right now to destroy your democracy.
Right.
This is your country too. Figure out how you're going to get it back.
Thank you.
That's right.
So, were you going to say something, Dr.
No,
Hendricks?
no, just agree.
Yes, okay. So we've had several questions come in from the participants, and I'm going to read a few of them if any of you would like to address them. One of them says Christian nationalists and white evangelicals often try to portray themselves as morally pure and persecuted. Why is this narrative so effective within that sector?
Mhm.
Would
Because they've
any-
lived with it the whole time. I mean, I think, you asked this question, I know, out of curiosity, which you don't understand it, but that narrative has been a narrative that has been in place for a long time. And it's a narrative that is purposeful to put them on the outside. But the real ideas, and this is what I wrote about in my book, this is about power and gaining power. And once you understand that they've always wanted power and we're going to use it in any way that they can, you can look aside all of this talk about, persecution and all of this because they're not the Christians who are being persecuted. Christians who are being persecuted are people who are dying in other countries right now. Palestinians were persecuted. Okay, we have Palestinian Christians who've died. So if you can't even just get to that point and realize when you got a con job, this is a con job, but it's a con job based on the way that they want to read their theology. And I think that's an important part of how evangelicals have been able to sort of win their way around everything and pretend as though that they're innocent in all of this when they're really not innocent at all. They have put up the structures to figure out how to take down our democracy. And when it comes for them, because it will come for them, then they're going to cry persecution. And then this is like the boy who cried wolf. I'm not going to pay attention because you've been crying about persecution all this time and it's not real.
Yeah, I'd say real quickly, there's 150 years at least of this persecution narrative. It comes right out of the Lost Cause after the defeat of the Confederacy, right? So the language you would hear is, well, first of all, the Civil War is not the Civil War; it's the War of Northern Aggression, right? So we're the persecuted ones, right? From federal hostilities, come down here to tell us, how to live. So the whole states' rights thing was about Southern states being persecuted, not being able to live their quote way of life. That word "way of life," right, kind of floats around in this toxic brew as well. But so it's got such a long history. Civil rights, same thing. The fact that it took federal troops, right, to integrate institutions in the South, right, and so that was another federal intervention, right, in the Southern way of life from a white Christian point of view. So I mean, this is like deep in the DNA, and then I think you put that on the where it has a kind of kernel of reality that it's tapping into is in the demographic change in the country today, right? We got to also take into account that 20 years ago, this country was still a majority white Christian country. Go back to the early 2000s, 54% of the country identified as white and Christian. Today, that number is 41% identify as white and Christian. So even if they don't know those numbers, I do think white Christians realize, like, okay, the words you do not hear from white Christians or anymore are moral majority, right? Because they know they don't have the numbers. That's why they're gerrymandering everything right and left, because the numbers simply aren't there. So they have to turn to anti-democratic means to pull off, as Dr. Butler said, it's about power, right? So how do we hold on to power? But why is it that power, that narrative so powerful? Because it has been passed down father to son, mother to daughter, generation after generation after generation. It is deep in the lore, deep in the culture, deep in the theology of white Christianity.
It even goes back and well, yeah, to the Westward March when the Native Americans were trying to protect themselves. It was the white settlers who were the victims, right? When you look at Westerns, I grew up with Westerns, and I must admit, I watch them all the time. And it can be very offensive because, you know, in these Westerns that were the primary, genre in the 50s and 60s. Westerns had westerns, a zillion westerns, and it was always the white folks who were the victims of their own aggression. And so it just runs so very, very deep.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. I have a comment here that says most Black church leaders have no accountability, so the apathy is rampant. That's a comment. But here's a question. How do we create spaces where pastors can unlearn harmful formation, reclaim their prophetic voice, and re-enter the work of justice and humility with humility and courage? How do you unlearn harmful formation?
One thing it could do, I'm thinking this. I don't know if this is the case. One thing you can do is start changing what the church gatherings, the denominational gatherings, are what they are about. More education, more consciousness raising, changing perspective, changing, that kind of thing. Also, we need more literature to raise consciousness, and that goes back again to this church thing. You can find their preaching books. Everybody's writing a preaching book these days in the church, but there's very little about raising political consciousness or about understanding the political economy, all of that. So those are kinds of things that I think we can do. One other thing, and this might be unrealistic and it might sound offensive, but you know, when I was, in the cultural nationalist movement, I was a street soldier. I said that we confronted church folk, and we need to have a movement to start confronting these charlatans, these folk who are wasting the people's resources every Sunday. We really need to start challenging some of these of Latter-day Pharisees, and need to start calling them that because they are enemies of our people's future. I hate to put it that way, but ultimately they're enemies of our people's future. They might make them feel good in the short term, but in the long term, they're not doing anything but changing the way people feel, not the way they live at all.
Mhm. Mhm. Um, Dr. Jones, I think you've addressed this to some extent, but the question is it more effective to have the white church to
Mm.
protest and come against the white nationalists? The black church has been fighting social issues for decades.
Yeah. Well, like I said, the that piece I wrote after the election, yeah, I think I did want to put, the blame where it belongs, right? We don't have Donald Trump without white Christians in this country. And that I think just full stop, period, you know, that needs to be said. Because what happened after the election, I think, is people were like, oh, black men, they move from here to here, and oh, Latino men, they move from here to here. And there was like all this kind of micro analysis down around black and brown, particularly men, where they moved toward, and they did move some toward Trump, but they were nowhere near where white men were for Trump, right? And that's I think the story is kind of making sure that I, for one, am really happy to see like Reverend Wolf was the one who had that his picture. He's down on the pavement and he's looking up. Reverend Black in Chicago. So these are white Presbyterian and Baptist ministers that are putting their bodies on the line, and I actually think that's quite appropriate. For the white church to take the lead. Here's the problem: there is no muscle memory in the white church for doing this, right? And I think in a way there's like more resources, and it's not simple. It's certainly some, maybe it's atrophied even some in the African American churches, but it's just not there for the most part. So I think most white Christians are having to like learn this anew. So it's a little bit of more of a challenge there. But I for one am like happy to see these white ministers being on the front line saying, yeah, yeah, yeah. Because they've got more security here, and they may get roughed up and beat up, but the chances of them getting hauled off and disappeared into some facility in Louisiana for 3 weeks is probably not that high.
Mhm. Last Monday we had Father Flager with us, white Catholic priest,
Yep.
even though his church is predominantly black, but he too is on the front lines, and we had great discussion with him.
Chicago. And let me say also, Robbie, part of it, the problem is not just white church, but the complacency of the black church
Yeah. Mhm.
has a lot to do with it. If black churches had been more activist, it could have made a difference. If they had stood up and challenged the lies that were being told, and the damn near deification of Trump as a messiah, if they'd stood up and challenged it, it could have had an impact, but they never did.
Yeah, and I'll just say one other thing too. Like, we got the statement from the Anthony. I'd love to hear what you have to say about this. The statement from the Catholic Bishop's
Mm,
office. Um, so we get a statement,
yes.
right, that kind of calls out, you know, harmful rhetoric against immigrants and harsh policies. It does not mention Donald Trump's name once, right, in this thing. So, but I don't know. I'm just going to tee this up, Anthony. I'd love to hear
Oh,
what you.
I'm ready for it.
Yeah.
Hang on. I'm ready for it because I just wrote about it for MSNBC. I'll put it in the chat.
Yeah.
This is why the only thing I'm going to talk about from here on out is immigration because the Catholic bishops are just the weakest group of people. I just need to tell you that they are co-opted. It is terrible. I still cannot stand. If I see Cardinal Dolan, I just wish they would go ahead on and sit him down for good because basically the stuff he said after Charlie Kirk talking about he was a great
Mhm.
gospel person and everything, that was just reprehensible.
Right.
I think that Pope Leo has it right. I think that that has challenged them. What they did do with the statement, I'll give you a little story about the statement because I actually watched everything that happened in the Bishops' Conference meeting. The reason why you had one very strong line in there was because of Cardinal Shupich, who is from Chicago, who basically said, and I'm going to quote this from the piece. Hang on a second. I want to pull it up because I didn't get it just right because I want you to hear what he actually had to say. And I think it's really important because it's one of those things in which one line can change something, right? And the way that this got changed was it was already something that was not a strong statement. It was a nice statement, basically. But it wasn't a statement that was going to hold a lot of weight until he added one particular line. I want to make sure I get it right. So just bear with me for 1 second because I did this last Friday and I want to make sure that I get it just right. So I'm pulling it up right now. But essentially, the line that he said was that we oppose the keeping of people. Here we go. Got it. Hang on a second. Here we go. And I'll put this in the chat for everybody. Basically, the title of the piece was "Immigrants Deserve a Stronger Defender Than This New U.S. Catholic Leader." The person who is over the Catholic bishops right now is a nice guy who's been, there for immigrants, but he's also a big giant conservative who is, been in a lot of places and is not as friendly to this administration. He basically said right after his election that he wanted more light than heat. And I'm like, dude, you need heat now because basically your people are being picked up. And there are numbers about how many people will be lost in the Catholic Church if this continues. And it is going to decimate the Catholic parishes in this country. So here's the line. The sentence was added to it. We oppose the indiscriminate mass deportation of people. And I said in the piece that that should be the talking point of every Catholic clergy person in the United States right now. It is a very simple, straightforward statement. You don't have to put out all this stuff about we feel like this, we feel like that. Just come out and say it. All you got to say is we oppose this. This is wrong. And I think part of the moral issue in this country right now is that we don't have enough people who will actually say something that is moral, true, and right, which is we oppose this thing that is happening. And so for Black churches and churches more broadly, starting to just say this one thing, we oppose this. We do not stand with this. You are not part of us. We do not like this. This is wrong. And if you just start to say what is wrong and what is right, just like you have to talk to little 5-year-old kids, because this is where we're at right now. We have people who are crossing lines every day, crossing boundaries that nobody would ever have crossed before. This has not been a nation that has been great. I talked to a series of nuns 2 months ago, and a Black nun said to me, and this just killed me. She's like, "Well, this has been a great nation. How could this be happening? This is a great nation." I said, "Oh, excuse me. You have not been in any of my classes. I need to tell you something, sister. I don't mean to be rude to you, but this is not a great nation. This is the great nation that had slavery. This is the great nation that had, people march on a death march, Native Americans. This is the nation that did all this stuff. Understand that this nation has not ever been perfect. It is not good. No nation has ever been that. But if we're going to strive for that, you need to stop believing the lies that everybody has told you."
Mhm.
So I think this is really important to be able to just speak some basic truth, and that the Catholic churches, the Catholic bishops had to have one of their own say, can we just put this line in here so that we can say what it is we actually oppose instead of this mealy mouth stuff that y'all are saying? Because right now I got people in my dioceses who are being picked up, who make a tremendous part of what makes the Catholic Church vibrant in this nation. That's it. I mean, we couldn't even get them. I mean, I'm going to go back a little bit to before the election. We couldn't even get these bishops to say anything about the Haitians. They're predominantly Catholic.
Right.
They wouldn't say anything about all the horrible stuff that was happening with the Haitians.
Mm.
So this is where I'm like, everybody can get it from me now. I may be over here sitting across the pond, but let me tell you, this stuff is over here too. And the only reason why they might make it where we don't make it is because they're not as religious as we are. Our
Mm.
problem right now is we're too damn religious in our country. And we got people who have pretended to be religious and pretended to be all these things who are actually wielding religion for power. And that is the thing that we have to understand if we're going to understand anything about trying to fix where we are right now.
Mm.
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 Dr.
Mm.
Hendricks, would you like to weigh, or Dr. Jones? Okay.
No, I was just going to say, I knew she'd have a little something to say about that.
Just a little something, huh? Right, right, right.
I'm going
Thank
to
you,
put this in
Dr.
the chat
Butler.
right now. So if people want to read it, I can just share it with you.
Yes, yes.
What's so disgusting about this, and thank you, Anthony. I'm glad you unpacked that way. What's so disgusting is that um, these leaders are supposed to know the dictates of their faith, and um, and they do know, and just shows that their allegiance is to an institution, uh,
Mm,
and it is a hierarchical institution. It's a dominationist institution. It's always, well, I can't say always, I don't know always, but for centuries upon end, it's been about dominating the world. And and we just have to try to make it clear that that is who these people are. They don't really speak for the gospel. They speak for their institutions, but they're about institutional maintenance and not serving the dictates of the gospel. And that's a sad thing, but it's also so damn dangerous because the institution has so much power, so much hegemonic reach that it can define what is the faith and what is not the faith. And what they're defining, um, if not explicitly, implicitly, is that white supremacy is all right. Destroying people is all right. Now, if these were white folks being treated like this, would these Catholic bishops be acting that way? I doubt that. No. Mm-mm.
No. Oh, they'd be in the street,
Oh,
Obery.
no question.
They'd be in the street.
Let's
So,
pick up on that little thread, Ober, because I think it's really Anthony had some of this thread too, but I mean this idea that what is the faith and what isn't the faith. I think it's in moments like these where we are answering that question right now. And we're answering that question for ourselves, and we're probably answering that question for the generation right behind us as well, right? Because they're watching what we're doing. And they may react to it, they may come along, but I mean, I think it's really important that, like, yeah, these kind of crucible moments, they are defining moments, and they have long downstream effects. And so, what we do or don't do in these days, we're going to be living with for quite a while.
Yeah, and I think the question is not what is Christian and what's not, but more basically, what does the text, what does the gospel say? Right? Because I mean, and basically, right? Because everybody calls themselves Christian now. Charles Manson called himself a Christian, right? The Ku Klux Klan called himself a Christian. Yeah, and so for me, I just don't even get into what's true Christianity and what's not. It's like, what did Jesus teach? Okay, and that's different from what you're teaching. But I think we're probably saying the same thing, right?
Yeah.
so we're winding our time down. I'm going to ask one final question that's in the chat. Well, there are several, but we don't have time to address them all. But here's this one. It says, how can one counter the individualism of being personally saved, the tendency toward greed and self-interest, the fear and scapegoating of the other, and advocate for community spirit and serving one another to flourish and prosper?
I
I'd
have
like
a
to
very
that.
simple thing to say. Very
Okay.
simple.
Go ahead.
Go out there and volunteer.
Hmm.
Go get out in your community and go do something. I
Mhm.
mean, I think that this individualism is about people not connecting to each other, or you don't like your church, so you go to another church or whatever. Go out there and go get, we're gonna have a bunch of food lines next week of people needing to get food. I mean, in Philadelphia, I have to tell you that from the beginning of the summer to the end of the summer, it has been incredible how many more people have been in line for food. I have a congressperson who is in my district who gives out food every Wednesday and Friday, and he's needed more help because the line is wrapping around the block now. And
Mhm.
I think that if you get out of yourself and start doing some of these things that Jesus said to do anyway, then you might be able to find yourself in a different way and stop thinking about your salvation. I think that we want answers for things, and we want, when you hear people like us talk, you want us to give you the answer. You are the answer. You
Yeah.
are the answer. Do something. You are the answer.
So,
You're the answer to so many things in your own community that can change, but you have to see yourself as being part of that answer.
hmm.
Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, and I want to answer as a biblical scholar because, I became a biblical scholar um, because there's so much misinformation that has, particularly, well, my focus was Black folk, have them so oppressed. And it's so wasting their time and resources. That's why I became a biblical scholar. So, to answer that question about individualism, for one thing, it's criminal that it's not clear throughout the church that, for instance, there is no Hebrew word for individual, biblical Hebrew. It's always the people or my people. It's a communitarian, collective ethos, a socialist ethos, if you will, because it's about the common good, or it's about the common good. Also, it's a theological problem because folk treat Christianity like it's Paulianity, and this whole notion of individual salvation and all that. I've asked people, and they say, "Well, I'm saved." So what does that mean, man?
Right.
Saved for what? I mean, that deliverance and salvation in the Hebrew Bible meant deliverance from oppression, deliverance from Pharaoh, and being saved from oppression. That's dealing with Paul, and Paul, has this platonic way that he differentiates between the body and the soul. And some folk are focusing on the soul and my salvation. Is like, no, your ass is what it's about. Excuse me, but that's what it's about. So again, it comes to having to really knowing what the faith is saying, because when Jesus taught, he taught ethics mostly. What not to what believe, but what to do, how to act. So we have to again raise the intellectual quotient and the informational quotient of the church with regard to the faith that people claim to believe in.
All right. Dr.
So
Jones?
yeah, so I recently I'm wrapping up a new book, and one of the things I did that was quite terrifying is I went back and read my journals from my high school years
Wow.
in my Southern Baptist church. And I was the kid who was at church 5 days a week. I mean, I was there all the time in the youth group and all that stuff. And you know, I would just pour my heart out in these journals, like prayer journals, devotional journals, like, and I'm praying for this and praying for that. And it's all like the kind of sociological term that it is expressive individualism, right? It's this emotive interiority that like just locks you up, right? And so all you can think about is the people in my immediate circles, my own like sins, which are mostly about sex and lust and greed and like the kind of personal vices that you can kind of wrap your hands around. But what the thing I really came to realize is, that's all by design, right? That's a theology designed to keep people like interior focused so the status quo can just chug along just fine, right? I
Mhm.
mean, it is not an accident that that expressive individualism kind of took off in evangelical circles. I mean, what else is like or how else are you going to keep like a sincere white Christian on the path, right? When they can see all this injustice all around them, how are you going to blind them to that? Well, you blind them by putting them on this hamster wheel of expressive individualism, where all they can do is just run and run and run and run and run, right? And they just see this like blinders on. And I think that it's a theology of white supremacy at the end of the day, right? That just protects the structures, protects the status quo. And so I think we got to break people out of that. But I think what Anthony said, yeah, get out and do something. Get to know some other people. But I do. I mean, I think it's evil. I think it's one of the worst things ever, right? That has happened to Christianity is the way this kind of expressive individualism took off because it essentially baptizes social injustice, right, and
Mm.
makes it just part of the background noise.
All right. Thank you so much. So we're about at the end of our session. Before I close out and allow people time to complete the survey, I'd like to invite the three of you just for a quick closing thought, closing comment. Where do we go from here? White Christian nationalism.
I
You've
think
just about said everything, but
I
do you
think the
have one
points have been
final thought?
made, but it comes down to struggle, a perspective of struggle, I think. And where we go from there, we have to struggle against this onslaught of evil that's looking to destroy our freedoms. Many of us destroy our lives and to destroy the futures of upcoming generations. It's about struggle. We have to fight.
Dr. Butler.
I think you have to prepare yourself that things are never going to be the same again.
Mercy.
And that's just the way it is. I mean, this is something that I have been talking about for a long time. Robbie knows this. And you used to say, Robbie, I was kind of like the fatalist in our group, right? And now you're on my side because
Yeah.
now you know.
Yeah,
And
me too.
I saw it coming. And when the train is coming at you like this, you have to start to think about two things. One is how to protect yourself, and how can I be part of a future that is going to be better? And so one of the things that I think about a lot now, and I'm trying to put my head around, is what do I do when everything falls apart and we're going to need people to pick this up? Because that's what's going to happen. And I think it's pretty clear that we're in that space. We don't even know how much the government has been destroyed, but it will take years. It's not, we're not talking about 2 years or 3 years. We're talking about decades to
Yeah.
put everything back together.
If
And I
we
think people have to come to that realization now and to start really trying to plan about how you make community differently, how you think about your church differently, what can you do as, an individual, but how do you get with like-minded people? I think that that's the most important thing right now is to create community with the people around you and to start thinking about how we're going to repair what has been destroyed.
Mm.
Thank you, Dr. Butler. Dr. Jones.
Well, I'll just piggyback on all that. I do think I've been trying to think about how, just make it personal. How can I prioritize what I'm doing with my time, uh, spend my resources in a way that I will not later regret,
All right.
knowing
Thank you.
knowing yeah, knowing where we are.
Knowing where we
Yeah.
are. Yes, exactly. So to Dr. Butler, Dr. Hendricks, and Dr. Jones, thank you all so very much for this important discussion tonight. And to all of our participants, thank you for being with us and for listening and for engaging and for offering some of you questions. The recording for this session will be sent to your email addresses, and it also can be found on the Hood Theological Seminary YouTube channel. The link for tonight's survey has been placed in the chat, so I'm going to ask those of you who are participating if you would please click on the link so that we can gather some data. Again, Dr. Butler, Dr. Hendricks, Dr. Jones, thank you, thank you, thank you so much. Let's stay together in the struggle. We'll see you next time. Take good care of yourselves. Get you some rest, Dr. Butler, and thank you for your
I'm
sacrifice.
I'm going to bed right now. Good
Okay.
night.
All right. Good night, everyone. And we'll stay on for all of the participants so that you can complete the survey. Thank you.
Well.